I would love to start off with a brief presentation on the state of OpenCloud. Why are we excited? Why now? And most importantly, what are the operational best practices that you as startup CEOs and founders need to think about as you're scaling your business? With that, let me kick off the presentation. I want to acknowledge the CEOs and founders that contributed to the presentation. Thank you so much. So if there's too much BS here, you can blame them, not me. But needless to say, we're bullish and we're long on cloud infrastructure and open source software. If you guys weren't, you wouldn't be here either. But let me tell you why. There's 5 reasons why we're really bullish on this segment of the market. First and foremost, you see the public cloud vendor revenues. This is a leading indicator of how much money is being spent on cloud infrastructure. Between the 3 cloud vendors, they've grown their LTM revenue from $8 billion to almost $80 billion in just 5 years. There's almost no public company that I'm aware of that has grown that fast at this scale. You look at it another way, you strip out the cloud revenues from Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and collectively the $72 billion of revenue, and you apply an average market multiple of 8x on these companies' revenue, there's roughly $500 billion in market value created just in the last 5 to 6 years. Despite that, we are still in the early stages of cloud adoption. What you see here is the percentage of total IT spending that is allocated to cloud infrastructure and cloud vendors. The $72 billion we talked about is just around 10% of the $700 billion that goes in IT spending, right? And we are 5, 6 years in this journey. So the future is clearly bright, even though we say it's hard to find companies at that scale grow this fast. This is the law of large numbers, where the markets are so large and changing so rapidly that there's another 90%, another $600 billion in revenue, just dislocating IT hardware spend. Not to mention that the pie could expand. Cloud can make IT spending so easy to consume that the pie could expand much bigger than the $700 billion we show here. I think there's some good evidence that public and private market investors believe in the same growth trajectory, the same growth thesis, which is why just over the last 2-3 years, you've seen roughly $30 billion in private company valuations, some of them including battery companies, and roughly $100 billion in IPOs and M&As just in the last 3 to 4 years of truly the first crop of cloud companies exiting. Not to mention the biggest software acquisition ever, as I mentioned, IBM's acquisition of Red Hat for $34 billion. And we'll have Paul talk about their journey, taking it from sub-billion to $30 billion in value. But it's been an incredible early signal in terms of how bullish the market is on cloud infrastructure and open source. The cloud building blocks are exciting, but really all they're doing is they're helping business buyers not worry about the minutiae of IT infrastructure. If I'm running a business and I'm in the wealth management business or travel hospitality, all cloud is doing is saying, move all the non-core stuff to somebody else so I can start innovating at the application layer. If I'm Goldman Sachs, my value is based on a better wealth management application, a better payment application, not how well I run Kubernetes or Docker. And so what we're excited about further is 23 million developers are pushing software, pushing innovation multiple times a day as opposed to once every 6 months, thanks to the cloud. And second, there's roughly 800 million knowledge workers, many of whom can use low-code, no-code programming frameworks in order to act like software developers. So if you thought this dislocation from IT hardware to cloud infrastructure and open source is exciting, I think this path of software developers and non-software developers pushing innovation could be 3 to 5x the size of the cloud infrastructure market. And of course, security is evergreen. As cloud expands, the size of the security spending alongside that expands as well. So roughly another $100 billion in security spend. So As you can see, there's multiple reasons for us to be excited about cloud, and I hope you guys will agree that we're just at the beginning stages of this exciting journey. Now, one may wonder, why now? A lot of us have been thinking about this extended bull run for the last 10 years. Is this the end of the journey? Are we kind of at the cusp of a recession? Who knows? I can't predict that, but I will say the future for cloud infrastructure and software is generally bright. We think this is just the early stage of the journey for 4 reasons. First and foremost, major enterprises are finally modernizing their stack. We sit here and think that Okta and Facebook and Twilio are a proxy for how major enterprises operate. But remember, Silicon Valley is a 50-year-old phenomena. It's a relatively recent phenomena. And you have banks that are 200 years old, oil and gas companies, insurance companies that are they're much older than the cloud infrastructure, let alone IT spending. And I think many of them are finally catching up and modernizing their IT stack. They just can't afford not to. And so if you think about it, if IT spending continues the way it has, I think you'll see budgets and discretionary budgets for trying new things. But even if we enter a recession, there's labor shortage, and these companies just cannot afford to not modernize themselves. In order for you to be relevant as an oil and gas drilling company, you have to use AI to figure out when is it worth drilling, when is it not. In order for you to succeed as a wealth management company, you have to know how to handle millennials with neobanks and better robo-banking products leveraging AI. You just cannot afford to be irrelevant. And so we think that the major dislocation from IT spending of $700 billion to cloud is purely driven by major enterprises that drive US GDP modernizing themselves. And I personally feel it's somewhat recession resistant because they have to accelerate their adoption of technology if the recession were to hit. Who would have known? GE, Honeywell, JPMC actually have more software developers than Facebook, Salesforce, and Uber. Just goes to say, as every company is becoming a software company, major enterprises have to modernize themselves. They have to buy software developers. It's not an option. It is a must. The second reason we think we're in the beginning of the journey is this whole migration from white-collar to blue-collar software. I know this is kind of a noisy slide, but the net is, if you look at the application layer, roughly $800 billion in market cap has been created selling to mostly desk workers, white-collar workers. Think data scientists, accountants, salespeople, marketing tech. There's roughly 2x the number of people that are blue-collar workers, from general contractors to plumbers to electricians to SMB workers. It's been uneconomical to sell software to them. But today, thanks to cloud, thanks to the speed of innovation, thanks to mobile devices, you can create a market that is just as big, if not bigger, selling to these blue-collar workers. Third, look at the number of devices. Population stayed relatively flat, but we've had a 100x increase in the number of IoT devices. Just in my home, I had 3 PCs, 2 laptops and a PC, and now there's 38 devices, the last count. I did check that, Roger, so we talk about this every month. 38 devices between Nest, Dropcam, smart fridge, electric cars. The number of devices we have are compounding at a pace we haven't thought about. Now, nobody cares about my Nest thermostats, but there are some very interesting use cases, whether it's healthcare, leveraging medical devices, shows why Google bought Fitbit. It's much more in the data. There's some interesting use cases around energy companies, hedge funds. This is net new spend, a 100x increase to 50 billion IoT devices. The data they generate, the compute spend they generate, is net new expansion of this IT opportunity, predominantly in the cloud. And fourth, not to mention, this is more of a proxy of what happens in this room, you have the cutting-edge companies that are pushing the envelope. As you have more data, more voice, more video, there's more and more interesting use cases from cutting-edge companies that are pushing the envelope with AI and ML. Whether it's satellite imagery that you're looking at to predict the state of the economy, or whether it's conversational intelligence that companies like Gong and others are doing to figure out how sales guys can be more productive, how they can improve the user experience. There's multiple use cases where companies are pushing the envelope. So as you can see, there's multiple reasons to be excited about this space. Between US GDP catching up and companies modernizing themselves, to a net expansion of the opportunity from IoT and blue collar, there's 50 billion reasons here to be excited. And I think you guys would all agree, which is the reason why you're probably here. But what are you to do if you are a CEO, a founder, who's building a company in this space? How are you going to explore the path ahead? This path of rising on cloud, open source, has been quite different than the way perpetual software companies were built, the way application software companies were built. And we at Battery have been fortunate to fund some incredible companies over the last 35 years, see the path from 0 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to a billion, over and over again. So what we thought would be helpful is to share kind of the top 10 operational best practices that you can implement today. If you're a startup that has launched a product, is thinking about go-to-market monetization, or you're a scale-up that has achieved a 10 million mark and looking to expand to 100 million, put the right infrastructure in place to run a public company. Here's 10 operational best practices that I hope you will find helpful. First and foremost, you have to focus on individual software buyers and influencers. The days where you can just sell to the CIO or the CTO and hope they will push it down to the troops, I think those days are gone. It's up to you as a startup CEO, startup founder, to keep the end user journey in mind. Mind you, this is for both top-down and bottoms-up companies. Whether you're a top-down company like MongoDB or Elastic, where you're selling to a CIO a database product, you still have to focus on the end user using the product. Otherwise, it ends up being shelfware. It's going to show up in churn the next year. And if you're a bottoms-up company, you absolutely have to keep the end user in mind. Because the journey typically with a company like Datadog or JFrog or Atlassian Jira almost always ends up with an individual user with a low-friction sale, adopting the product, the department buying it, and then eventually the CIO shows up and says, wait a minute, or 10 departments buying it. So needless to say, individual software buyer or influencer is absolutely critical. People pay for what they see, so just keep that in mind. Second, if you keep the end user experience in mind, open source could be a very effective customer acquisition channel. I could be outdated here, and Sahir, keep me honest, but Mongo had 60 million downloads at the time of IPO, roughly 3 downloads for every one of the 20 million developers you have. And it only took them less than 1%, or 15,000 customers, to go to 350 million in revenue. Elastic has something similar. And the path to 1 billion in revenue, it purely rests on converting 1 to 2% of your open source users. Of course, you got to keep enough value in the open source product to convert from the free to the paid product. But the point here being, there's enough interest from a technical buyer to try your product without talking to a sales guy. If your product does the talking and you can get your product working in an open source channel, conversion from free to paid is very well set up, and you have a sustainable business model over time. The second point here, which is somewhat controversial, is open source is not the only way to get companies to try your product with low friction. You've seen just as many closed source companies, think Atlassian, think Twilio, think PagerDuty, that leverage the cloud-first model. As I mentioned, most of the 800 million information workers are using some cloud service in some shape or form. They have a vested interest to try your product. So if you can leverage open source to get 60 million downloads and then have them convert to a paid product, that's great. But you could just as well use your cloud service to get customers to try your product, and on a time basis or an advanced feature basis, get them to convert to a paid product. Open source or cloud native freemium are both effective mechanisms to drive customer acquisition. And remember, these are customer acquisition methods. Open source is not a business model. Cloud native is not a business model. It's ultimately a customer acquisition channel. Fourth, if you are leveraging open source or cloud native, you can truly solve the discovery problem leveraging cloud marketplaces. Amazon, Azure have helped several companies. It's kind of a unique kind of frenemy situation where they've helped many companies get customer leads on their cloud marketplace. Amazon has 500 million hours on EC2, and therein lies the key. They're not doing this from the goodness of their heart. For every dollar that you sell on Amazon Marketplace, you're probably going to spend $3 to $5 on EC2 and S3. They're counting on you in order to make their product sticky. And so whether they use Snowflake or they use Redshift, whether they use MongoDB or they use Dynamo, they have every reason to push you, and you can take advantage of that to discover your customers rather than spending several dollars on sales development reps and discovering prospects. You can leverage the cloud marketplace. And companies like Snowflake and Matillion and many others have effectively done that. Fifth, this is one we just came up with, but it sounded intelligent, so I'll just go with it. Any way you get to the customer, time to value, or time to awesome, as many companies call it, is absolutely key. 90 seconds for an individual user to know what the hell they're doing there, 90 minutes to see what value they're getting and why they need it. And if those two are taken care of, you should be able to land your first lead in 90 days. Let the product do all the selling, and if you focus on the user experience and the user journey, this rule of 90 should really help you land deals effectively. Rule number 6, don't get customers to the 5-yard line and then lose them on complicated pricing. Simple pricing really helps you close a customer in an effective mechanism. And we did a recent study about 9 months ago where we said some of the most successful companies that are in the top quartile growth almost always had their pricing published on the website. Simple pricing aligned very easily with the customer's perceived value. Right? So, for example, if you're Jira or if you're Postman and you're selling a developer productivity tool, price it based on the price per developer. If a developer costs me $250K and I'm spending $1,000 to make them 10% more productive, no-brainer, right? If I'm a database or an analytics company, it's based on usage. The more data I crunch, the more value I get, based on the amount of data, and that ties directly to value. And if you're a middleware, whether it's integration or API, it's based on how many integrations I have. So keep pricing simple, and that should really unleash the value to a quick sale. So what do you do with all these sales guys you have? We've seen tremendous success in many companies that get sales the classic way, get SDRs to uncover leads, close new logos. Every rep usually is at 1.2 to 1.5 million quota. It's a 6 to 9 month ramp cycle. All that is great. But if you're leveraging a bottoms-up self-service motion, here's some other best practices you can leverage. First and foremost, somewhat controversial, get the reps to focus on consumption of the product. Don't just sell shelfware. Focus on consumption because that is the leading indicator to expansion. Inside sales model seems to have worked quite well with a 600 to 750K quota and a 3 to 4 month ramp. You should be able to get a low customer acquisition cost, but if you keep the customer quality, incentivize your reps to close deals fast but not compromise on the quality. And if you do them both, you can land and expand without compromising each other. So we've seen examples in a portfolio where we have inside sales reps carrying a 70K quota, making 3 million quotas consistently, 70K OTE, making 3 million quotas consistently. And the key has been incentivize them on deal velocity and deal quality. Fourth, this is probably one of the more controversial ones because most of us have been trained to sell annual or multi-year deals. But unfortunately or fortunately, most cloud providers are selling customers a pay-as-you-go model. Amazon charges you based on how much you use on spot pricing for the most parts. Azure has changed their compensation model to compensate reps on how much Azure is consumed, not how much is sold. So your customers are getting used to asking you as well, saying, hey, why don't I pay as you go? I don't want to pay you up front and end up not using it. And is that really all that bad, after all? From what we've seen from early indications, I think if you focus on selling customers what they want to buy rather than what you want to sell, that generally aligns well. And so we've seen multiple examples where reps can carry a quota for enterprise sales on an annual basis and a pay-as-you-go. And more often than not, customers that start on a pay-as-you-go, if the product does the selling, they almost always expand within 6 to 9 months to get price protection. And the incremental dollars the customers spend are more accretive because you don't need sales effort to go sell them every additional dollar. Case in point, there's 2 companies here, Twilio and MongoDB, whose share price rise has aligned quite well with their pay-as-you-go pricing model. You don't penalize customers for going over, you encourage them to go over, and they lock into large net dollar expansions over time. Number 9, switching from offense to defense. One of the areas that has been somewhat controversial is how friendly is your cloud provider after all? And this ties to open source licensing models. Some of the early success in open source, which was mostly on-prem, was driven by Apache licensing model or MIT model, because you were selling to enterprises who weren't going to go copy your software and run this independently. In this day and age, when you're working with cloud providers, some of the more interesting models have been GPL, server-side licensing. Make sure that you're leveraging your cloud to discover and find out prospects, not necessarily hand over the trophy to them when you find them. So keep the licensing models in mind. And needless to say, number 10, instill a culture of continuous learning, rapid iterations inside your organization. If you're helping your customers transform themselves with agile software, you can't afford to be not agile yourself. So whether it's continuous design, continuous learning, continuous customer feedback, we're in this incredible period where some best practices around each element of that cycle to drive a continuous learning model. So now that we've talked about operational best practices, let's focus on how that translates to success as a public company. I know many of you guys are still a few years away from that. IPO is, for us, frankly, IPO is just the starting journey for many of these companies, because all it does, it gives you credibility to get big banks to spend 7-figure and 8-figure deals with you. Many of our companies have used IPOs to turbocharge their growth from 100 million to $1 billion and beyond. And most companies, if you look at the market, whether it's Palo Alto Networks or VMware or Splunk and others, have actually added more value as a public company than a private company. So we do think about what things can you do today to be successful as a public company, because we think that is just going to turbocharge your growth. You have to start putting things in place now so that when you're running a public company 3 to 5 years from now, you're set up well to accelerate your growth and stay efficient along the way. So as we think about the KPIs that matter, there are really 5 things that matter to public companies and investors who are valuing public companies. And you as startup founders have to think about some of them now as you're growing from 10 to 25 to 50 so that you're well placed when you hit 100. First and foremost, needless to say, if you're indexed to cloud and open source software, selling with cloud marketplaces, using a cloud-friendly pricing model, and landing expanding, you definitely should benefit from cloud growth ramp. If you can get to 70% compounded annual growth, that definitely translates into a significant multiple. As you can see on the left-hand side, companies on the left that have indexed themselves to cloud experience 70% growth, often have 2 to 2.5x the revenue multiple than other companies who haven't. Second, magic number or sales efficiency. All this measures is how many dollars are you generating for every dollar you're spending in sales and marketing. Best companies are over 1 versus an average of 0.7. And if you tie it back to best practice number 2 and 3, if a product does the selling, your sales guys have to do less. And that should translate into a better, faster sale and higher deal velocity. If you recall the 90-minute value to a 90-minute first deal, that translates directly into a magic number, which is best of class. Third, we talked about this in rule number 4 and 5. If you focus on the customer quality, just because you're closing deals fast doesn't mean you have to compromise the quality of the deal. Capital One may often start with a small deal and may end up growing it to 5-10x over time, versus a gaming company most likely is not going to do it. And so if you focus on incentivizing your sales reps on quality of the customer and the deal velocity, that should translate into a higher dollar-based net retention. All this is measuring is for every dollar you sold in year 1, how much are you selling in year 2 and beyond. And the best companies, CrowdStrike, Okta, Datadog, and others have had more than 140%. And all this ultimately reflects in the lifetime value to customer acquisition cost, which is the number 1 leading indicator to your profitability. In this day and age, when you look at WeWork and Uber and companies that are bleeding money, ultimately public market investors care about growth and efficiency. Lifetime value to CAC is a very good measure of your efficiency over time. The lesser you spend on acquiring customers and the higher the quality of the customers, you should spend less upfront and make more over time. and that translates to a high lifetime value to CAC, which is ultimately what you want to drive to. And I'm going to skip this. And case in point, if you look at multiples of public companies, they're directly tied to growth and lifetime value to CAC. So think about what you can do. Which of those 10 best practices can you apply today so that 3-4 years down the line, when you're 100 million, you have a path to go to 200, not 120, and do so efficiently without burning a lot of money. So anyway, there's a lot of learning here from both public and private companies. Let me wrap up very quickly, now that I'm about time, by just our own thoughts on future of OpenCloud. The first thing I'll say is, many of us, are used to this terminology. Past performance is not an indicator of future success, and yet past performance is all we have to figure out how big this market could be. And as investors and public market observers, we've consistently undersized these markets. What I show here is ServiceNow talking about their IPO filing and sizing the market at 45 billion, and more recently saying the market's actually 4x the size. Atlassian is the same way, and over again, if you look at history and the way folks have sized markets, it's very hard for us to look at the past and say the future is going to be brighter or darker, because all we're doing is linear extrapolation. Microsoft, of all people, has said, hey, software is not a $1 trillion market. It could be a $5 trillion market for all you know. You pick your number. 1 or 5 is big enough. So over the last 20 years, we've seen software continues to grow as a percentage of GDP. We've seen tremendous value creation, many in our portfolio, others hopefully will be in our portfolio. But we're really excited about the path ahead. If you think about it, 50 years of IT has taken us from 0 to 1 trillion. And if you end up anywhere close to 3 to 5 trillion over the next 30 to 50 years, based on the phenomena we have seen, I hope many of you will be here in our OpenCloud presentation 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And I'd love to have you again as a keynote speaker at that time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Stedman, who's going to introduce the first panelist. But thank you very much for your attention.